Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time, and we hope that you find this webinar useful. It's hopefully going to give you a lot of really good practical information, and hopefully you will take what you need out of this. If not, we will certainly have an opportunity to answer more questions toward the end of the presentation. So just a quick overview on the agenda. We'll go over the objectives, and then we'll sort of get into the content of Section 106 reviews and try to put it again into practical terms. We're going to end with a discussion on a real-life FRA project example or a sample of the types of things that we typically get within our organization. And we will have a Q&A portion to hopefully answer any questions that we have received during the registration phase, as well as questions that we received during the presentation itself. As you all have noticed, we will have a couple of polling questions throughout the webinar between the various modules. We're just using these to ensure that we're conveying the information in an understandable manner, and if we need to, we can double back on topics that we aren't doing well with. Mary pointed out the web links and resource links in the pods, so we will be referring to some of those throughout the presentation if you do want to pull up those materials as a reference as I am speaking. And again, the webinar is going to be recorded, and we will have it posted to the FRA website for independent viewing after today. At some point, one of the attendees in the registration phase had asked if certificates would be issued for the training, and the answer to that is no. We apologize for that, but we don't have that capability. All right, so what are the objectives? Our goal is to present information in a practical way related to the who, what, when, where, why, and how of a Section 106 review. This will give you an idea of what the Section 106 process is, how it's completed, how it is relevant to FRA grants or other projects where FRA is involved, potential time and cost implications on the project, and how grantees or project sponsors can work in coordination with FRA to complete the Section 106 review as quickly and efficiently as possible. And a quick note on the use of the terms grantee versus project sponsor. While generally a grantee refers to a project sponsor who receives monies or grant monies from FRA, FRA also works with other project sponsors to issue safety approvals or other project approvals that do not involve grant funding. Please note that the terms may be used interchangeably throughout the presentation, and that information contained in this webinar is applicable to both grantees and project sponsors. This webinar will not ultimately make you a Section 106 expert. However, we will provide additional information on how to learn more, including training information links if you choose to. All right, so the first bit of information we're going to touch on is the why and where of Section 106. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, or NEPA as we call it, requires federal agencies to consider the impacts of their projects on the human environment. The human environment consists of both the natural and physical environment and the relationship of people with that environment. NEPA is often referred to as an umbrella law because federal agencies use resource-specific laws and executive orders which relate to the natural and physical environment as shown here to determine impacts under NEPA. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, or NHPA, is one of those laws. Section 106 refers to a section within the National Historic Preservation Act. Similar to the intent of NEPA, Section 106 requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their actions specific to historic properties. Note that while every federal agency must comply with the same laws, each agency, including those within DOT, might have different procedures on how to do this.
We will get more into the specifics about differences between FRA and FHWA specifically in the Q&A portion of this presentation.
All right, so Section 106 is considered a critical pathway to grant obligation. If FRA issues grant funding or has an approval action for your project must comply with NEPA and NHPA. Generally referred to as environmental review, documentation to demonstrate compliance with these laws is completed during the award phase in the grant's life cycle, which is highlighted in yellow here. The environmental review documentation must be complete before FRA can obligate your grant. Beginning the environmental review early is critical, especially if your project has statutory deadlines. Section 106 can take anywhere from 1 month to 1 year to complete, depending upon the effects of your project on historic properties. There are 2 common misunderstandings related to environmental reviews that I'd like to try to clear up. The level of effort to document compliance with NEPA does not necessarily equate to the level of effort required to document compliance with NHPA. For example, if your project qualifies for a categorical exclusion under NEPA, it still may require extensive consultation with the State Historic Preservation Officer under NHPA within 106. Also, if your project is privately funded and does not involve FRA, another federal agency, or a state DOT authorized to act on behalf of the federal government, then you do not need to comply.
Next, we're going to get into the what's of Section 106 and the type of information that FRA needs to complete the process. Now we're going to talk about the basics of a standard Section 106 review. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their actions, also known as undertakings, on historic properties. The President's Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or ACHP, is the federal agency that wrote the instructions for federal agencies to comply with Section 106. These regulations can be found at 36 Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, Part 800. Section 106 must be complete prior to grant obligation and or the implementation of a project. There are 2 critical Section 106 concepts. What is an undertaking and what are historic properties? An undertaking is defined as any project, activity, or program funded by a federal agency, carried out with federal financial assistance, or requiring a federal permit, license, or approval. And a historic property is any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object that is included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Generally, a property must be 50 years of age or older to be considered historic. If you look at the images on the right, you'll see different examples of these types of historic properties. For example, in the upper left-hand corner, you see an object, an old wagon train. To the immediate right of that, you see a building, in this case, a historic train station. The middle image represents a historic district, which is the French Quarter in New Orleans. On the bottom left, you'll see a representation of a site or an archaeological site. And to the immediate right of that, you will see an example of a structure or a railroad bridge. In general, the nation's railroads date back to the early 1800s and are historically important in many ways, and therefore historic properties can include railroad infrastructure such as bridges, tunnels, culverts, passenger stations, operations buildings, as well as segments of railroad lines. The Section 106 process is a 4-step process. The first step is to define the undertaking and to initiate Section 106. The second step is to define the geographic area where project activities may affect building structures and soils, also known as the area of potential effects, and then identify historic properties that fall within that boundary. The third step is to determine if the project would affect any of the identified historic properties. If negative effects are anticipated, then the fourth step is to resolve those adverse effects. Similar to NEPA, Section 106 does not dictate a specific outcome such that historic properties must be preserved. However, alternatives that might avoid or minimize adverse effects must be considered during this step. If your project is flexible, it may be worthwhile to consider avoidance or minimization alternatives to minimize time delays and additional project costs. The regulations specify a number of entities that may be involved in a Section 106 review. This will include FRA and you as the grantee or the project sponsor. It may also involve a state or tribal historic preservation officer, federally recognized Indian tribes, consulting parties who have a demonstrated interest in the historic properties involved with the project, and the public. The ACHP may also be involved if there are adverse effects. Who is involved and their level of involvement will depend upon your project, the number and type of historic properties affected, and whether your project will result in adverse effects. Engagement with these different groups can involve notification, review and comment upon draft Section 106 materials, such as cultural resource reports or design plans, concurrence with FRA's determinations, and/or public comment periods. During step 2, the APE or area of potential effects must be established. APEs can be defined both horizontally and vertically, and an APE needs to account for both direct and indirect effects. And the image above, the red outline represents those types of effects, or the boundary we're drawing around what we would consider direct effects, and the yellow line represents those that we would consider indirect effects. Additionally, the APE also needs to account for temporary and permanent effects that result from your project. The APE is not necessarily confined within rail rights of way and will be unique for every project. APEs need to account for the entirety of your project, including the primary work site, as well as temporary work areas that support the completion of the project, including the creation of access roads, staging areas, and construction pads, to name a few.
So in defining the APE, there are certain questions that you as the grantee can ask to help define that. And some of those include, where will ground disturbing activities take place? A lot of times places such as pile driving, in-water work, to include barge anchors, placement of riprap, removal of debris, all these things here, sometimes they're overlooked, but are equally important to include in an area where historic properties could be potentially affected, in particular for archaeological resources. Other questions: what needs to be demolished, cut down, destroyed in order to facilitate your project? Are there historic districts immediately adjacent to your project? How far away will your project be seen from buildings, historic districts perhaps? Or are there a lot of natural features in the environment that somehow sort of isolate your project, and there won't be any other places where your project can be seen from? And then also, how far away will construction and/or operational activities be heard or vibrations felt? So some of the common mistakes that we see in the Section 106 review process is that grantees or project sponsors do not define an APE at all. They do not account for the temporary areas used to support construction activities, and they do not account for the view sheds or the geographical areas visible from a project's location. So once you define your APE, you then need to identify historic properties within it. Again, historic properties are districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. Historic properties can be listed in the National Register of Historic Places or eligible for listing in the National Register. The National Register itself is maintained by the National Park Service and overseen by an individual known as the keeper. It includes both historic and prehistoric properties found to be significant at a local, state, and/or national level.
There are very specific criteria that historic properties must meet in order to be listed in the National Register or considered eligible for listing. These were also established by the National Park Service.
So properties subject to Section 106 review do not currently need to be listed in the National Register. Properties that meet NPS criteria to be considered eligible must also be accounted for. This step is completed through a consultation process between FRA and a state historic preservation officer or tribal historic preservation officer if on tribal land, and with assistance from the grantee or the project sponsor. The determination as to whether a property is eligible for the National Register is part of the identification process. NPS eligibility consideration criteria are shown on this slide. In order to be considered eligible, railroad infrastructure must both retain integrity and be important in at least one of 4 categories. Railroad infrastructure is generally representative of events that demonstrate advances in transportation, the establishment of communities, or the enabling of trade, commerce, and economic growth, for example, the Transcontinental Railroad. Railroad infrastructure can be representative of persons, such as notable architects or engineers, railroad company owners, or individuals famous in railroad history, for example, Casey Jones. Also, railroad infrastructure can be representative of architecture or design, particularly for bridges and passenger stations. For example, the Thomas Viaduct in Elk Ridge, Maryland is the U.S. oldest multiple stone arched railroad bridge. There are many examples of railroads and rail infrastructure that are both listed in the National Register or eligible for listing in the National Register. And while archaeological remains of railroad infrastructure are not generally encountered on most projects, railroad infrastructure may still affect archaeological resources unrelated to the railroad, such as prehistoric or historic sites that predate the railroad, including those of significance to tribes, such as burials or habitation sites. And these must still be considered during the Section 106 review. Grantees need to provide certain information to FRA to support the identification and evaluation of historic properties. Some of this information is related to what resources are already listed in the National Register, what resources SHPO has on file as seen as eligible for the National Register that are in their records, what resources are 45 years of age or older, records related to previous ground disturbance or modifications to the structures or infrastructure being touched in your project, and any sort of cultural resource or archaeological reports in that project area. Now, just a quick note, you'll notice here that I have said 45 years of age or older, when in the past slides we've been talking about the criteria being 50 years of age or older. And I'm going to explain the discrepancy here. While the National Park Service criteria is 50 years of age or older, FRA generally defaults to considering properties that are 45 years of age or older and to provide wiggle room between project award and construction. Otherwise, your Section 106 review may actually be obsolete by the time you put a shovel in the ground. This is a pretty common practice amongst federal agencies to create efficiencies in the review process. One of the common mistakes that FRA sees with this step is that archaeological considerations, including underwater archaeology, aren't appropriately accounted for. This is especially prevalent in areas of new or greenfield construction or where in-water work will occur. So FRA does need supporting documentation to demonstrate that an area is previously disturbed or does not contain archaeological resources eligible for the National Register. So after you identify historic properties in your APE, then you must determine if your project will actually affect them. And on this slide, you will see some visual representations of things that are considered adverse effects versus things that are considered not adverse effects to historic properties. In general, effects are defined as any alteration to the characteristics of a historic property that qualify it for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Effects may diminish the integrity of a property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. They can be direct, such as the demolition of a structure or ground disturbance, or they can be indirect, such as the loss of structural integrity due to vibration or the introduction of new visual elements that didn't previously exist. They can also be adverse or not adverse. If the project activities affect properties in a negative way to the point where they wouldn't qualify for inclusion in the National Register anymore, then they are considered adverse effects. If the project activities don't compromise the integrity of the property, then they are considered not adverse. So in a very overly simplified manner, if an individual were to visit a site 6 months later and didn't notice a dramatic change in the property's appearance, then this likely would not result in an adverse effect. Grantees should consider if their project will involve any of the activities listed here, as these may cause adverse effects to historic properties. So examples of direct adverse effects may include, for example, the demolition and replacement of a historic railroad bridge or station platform, the substantial renovation or alteration of a train station or depot, and the replacement of wooden materials with concrete or metal materials. Examples of indirect adverse effects may include new or increased rail service, which may cause noise or vibratory effects to historic buildings located near the railroad, or introduce visual changes to a historic district. We've just discussed what a standard Section 106 review entails. Now we're going to talk about what an alternate streamlined way in which compliance with Section 106 might be achieved. The Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, per its regulations, is allowed to approve alternative ways for federal agencies to comply with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. In 2015, Section 11504 of the FAST Act, which is the Train Act portion, mandated that ACHP work with USDOT to develop an alternative method of Section 106 compliance for projects located in railroad rights-of-way. On August 17, 2018, the ACHP issued the program comment to exempt consideration of effects to rail properties within rail rights-of-way. The program comment, as we call it, can be used by any federal agency. Congress also directed that the Section 106 exemption be consistent with the exemption for interstate highways approved by ACHP in 2005. However, there are significant dissimilarities between interstate highways and the railroads, which resulted in differences between the highway exemption and the program comment issued for rail right-of-way. One of the main differences is that the nation's railroads have a much longer and varied history than the interstate highway system. As a result, a wide variety of repair, maintenance, and upgrade activities are exempt from Section 106 review under the program comment for rail right-of-way. However, entire rail lines and the nation's rail network are not exempt like highways. So the program comment for a rail right-of-way applies specifically to activities that are federal undertakings that affect rail properties listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register and are located within existing rail right-of-way and disturbed portions of the rail right-of-way. In relation to a property being historic, if your property has never been evaluated for the National Register and is suspected to be 45 years of age or older, it may actually be a time savings to assume the property is historic, but the project sponsor may be required to follow certain conditions, such as the use of in-kind materials or SOI qualified personnel, and we'll certainly get into those two concepts a little bit later. In other instances, it also may be more advantageous to complete a standard Section 106 review if the program comment conditions are not warranted. You should look at this on a case-by-case basis, and FRA can certainly help in assisting to decide what the best approach is regarding Section 106 compliance. You will also see that the Section 106 program comment for rail right-of-way can be applied to projects where environmental review is already in process or has not started. The program comment allows for this flexibility in determining when to apply the program comment to a project that has already been initiated. However, if the Section 106 process is already underway and has already involved extensive stakeholders and consulting party outreach, or your project has already resulted in conditions agreed upon between SHPO and the project sponsor, FRA may, at its discretion, decide to complete the standard Section 106 process rather than invoke the program comment. And the last bullet on this slide talks about that some projects will be subject to other program comments or standard Section 106 review. In the first bullet, there is the possibility that the program comment would cover part of your project, but not all. So we might have to do some sort of combination approach to applying both the program comment and then also completing a standard Section 106 review for the same project. And lastly, there might be instances where there are other agreement documents or other program alternatives in place that might be more relevant to your Section 106 process. And it certainly is possible that these other program alternatives or agreement documents would be the way to go in terms of 106. Ultimately, it's up to the federal agency to make the determination, but again, the program comment does not necessarily take precedence if there are other alternatives to comply with Section 106. The program comment includes exempted activities, also known as Appendix A, the exempted activities list. It has 95 exempted activities that span 13 different categories of work, as summarized here. These exempted activities generally apply to the maintenance, repair, and upgrade of existing rail properties, which is necessary to ensure the safe and efficient operation of rail operations. It is a list of routine activities known to have minimal or no adverse effects to historic properties if present. When an exempted activity is determined to cover one or more activities within your scope of work, it provides a shortcut to completing a Section 106 review, since no further Section 106 review would be required for that element of the project. And as a reminder, you can access this document in the web links portion or pod of the webinar today. When the program comment cannot be applied to a specific element of your scope of work or non-rail related historic property, such as archaeological sites or non-rail related historic districts, may be affected by your project, a standard Section 106 review is still required. Again, it is possible that parts of your project may be covered by the program comment. If that's the case, the scope of your standard 106 review would be narrowed to those historic properties and/or activities that are not covered by it. If you want to become more familiar with the program comment, FRA held a webinar in December of 2018. We certainly encourage you to view that webinar as well as materials related to the program comment on FRA's website. Access links, again, are provided in the web links screen in the webinar and or on the slide seen here. All right, we're going to take a quick break and get to our polling questions.
All right, our polling question. First one is, compliance with Section 106 is a critical pathway and can impact the timeline on my project's grant obligation. Answer A, true. Answer B, false. And we'll give that a few minutes or a few seconds. Okay, thank you all so much for taking the time to answer. The answer for that one was true, and 99% got it correct, so thank you all so much. Our next poll question is, historic properties subject to Section 106 are generally at least 50 years and can include railroad infrastructure such as bridges and tunnels, as well as segments of railroad line. A, true, B, false. All right. Thank you all for answering. 96% got that correct, and that was true. All right, our next polling question is the Section 106 program comment for rail ROW exempted activities applies to A, demolition, replacement of railroad bridges, B, routine repairs or maintenance of existing rail infrastructure to keep railroads operating safely and efficiently, C, acquisition of property to construct new rail line, D, construction of new passenger station. And we'll give just a few seconds for that. All right, thank you all for answering. The correct answer was B, routine repairs or maintenance of existing rail infrastructure to keep railroads operating safely and efficiently, and 91% got that correct. All right, back over to you.
Thank you, Mary. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about the how. How do we actually do a Section 106 review? There are 3 pathways to completing a Section 106 review. As mentioned previously, Section 106 must be complete before FRA can obligate your grant or approve your project. We will discuss these pathways in order of fastest to longest. This first pathway applies to projects that fall entirely within rail rights-of-way, where there are no non-rail historic properties in the APE, and all elements of the scope of work are covered by the exempted activities list. In other words, the project is entirely covered by the program comment. In this case, the grantee or project proponent matches the line items in the scope of work to the relevant exempted activity, which are specified by a letter and number. Additionally, the grantee should provide relevant supporting documentation to justify the proposal. FRA then verifies the appropriate application of the program comment, and lastly, compliance with Section 106 is documented in the NEPA decision document, likely a categorical exclusion, but sometimes this could also apply to environmental assessments or environmental impact statements. And at this point, Section 106 review is considered complete. In the second pathway, this applies to projects where the program comment is either partially applicable or not applicable at all. For these projects, this would mean that elements of the project fall outside of the rail rights-of-way, non-rail historic properties are in the APE, and/or only some, but not all of the elements of the scope of work are covered by the exempted activities list. In this case, a standard Section 106 review is conducted for those elements of the project that are not covered by the program comment. If a no adverse effect determination is reached, compliance with Section 106 is documented in the NEPA decision document, and the Section 106 process is complete. In the third pathway, if an adverse effect determination is made through the standard 106 review, the adverse effect needs to be resolved and mitigated. This is done through the negotiation and execution of a Section 106 agreement document. This document and the mitigated resolutions captured in it is created in consultation with consulting parties such as the SHPO, tribes, other consulting parties, and the ACHP. Once the document is finalized and executed, Section 106 is complete and the NEPA decision document is finalized. And just to give you guys an idea of roughly how our projects sort of fall into these 3 different pathways, over the past year, approximately 325 projects have been cleared entirely using the program comment exempted activities list. Next, we had approximately 100 projects that needed to go through a standard 106 review. And of those 100 projects, roughly between 15 and 20 have resulted in adverse effects that would require the negotiation of a programmatic agreement or memorandum of agreement. We'll now talk a little bit more in depth about how to apply the program comment exempted activities list in detail. In step 1, before reviewing the exempted activities list, the grantee should define an APE to ensure all potentially affected properties are within rail rights-of-way, are within undisturbed portions of the right-of-way, and meet the definition of a rail property. In step 2, the grantee applies the Appendix A exempted activities list to each line item in the scope of work. In step 3, the grantee identifies activities that require a standard Section 106 review, if any. In some cases, the grantee may not want to or may be unable to meet program comment conditions, such as utilizing in-kind materials. In other cases, such as grants that fund preliminary engineering, grantees may not have advanced project design enough to provide the level of detail that FRA needs to determine that historic properties are not adversely affected, and if the program comment is applicable. In these cases, a standard Section 106 review may be the more appropriate path. In step 4, the grantee submits the program comment proposal to FRA, following standard procedures for submitting environmental documentation, such as a categorical exclusion worksheet, and if applicable, they must also submit a draft Section 106 consultation package at this time as well. In step 5, FRA verifies the project sponsor's proposed program comment applicability and completes the NEPA decision document, or finishes the standard Section 106 review process. In Appendix A of the program comment, there is a section titled General Rule that specifies some conditions in applying the program comment exempted activities list. It specifies that FRA must verify an applicant's proposal to utilize the program comment and can request relevant documentation to support that proposal. At the very least, the grantee should include photos, dates of original construction of the infrastructure subject to the grant, plus dates of any substantive changes or alterations, the materials to be used, and a detailed narrative of the scope of work. So, for example, specifics about what components will be replaced and with what materials. Some proposals will require supplemental documentation, and there are a few activities that might trigger this request. Typically, these requests will include documentation for in-kind repairs. For those not familiar with the term in-kind, it means that new materials used in repairs or replacements should match the materials being repaired or replaced in design, color, texture, other visual properties, and where possible, the actual materials. Other triggers for additional supplemental documentation requests can include written justification when replacement instead of repair of historic materials must be done, confirmation that work is being performed or overseen by an SOI qualified individual when specified in Appendix A, or documentation of previous ground disturbance when ground disturbing activities are anticipated. And if you look at the slide, you will see some of the types of documentation that might help with these supplemental information requests. A few general notes before we actually walk through the standard Section 106 consultation process. Per the regulations, FRA is legally responsible for complying with 106, not the grantee. Therefore, grantees should assist FRA in the Section 106 process, but not complete it on FRA's behalf or independent of FRA. While FRA has historic preservation professionals on staff to help complete the Section 106 review, FRA does not do the Section 106 legwork. Rather, we provide technical direction to the grantees or the grantees' consultants and manage the Section 106 process. We expect grantees and or consultants to do the substantive work, such as conducting background research and surveys, preparing reports, etc., that ultimately are required to complete a Section 106 review. So in step 1, you'll see that we allow the grantee to informally coordinate with SHPO. Informally means that you can reach out to gather data, essentially identify any state-specific requirements that might be needed in reporting, request record searches or do record searches to figure out what existing historic properties may actually be in your project area. You can see if SHPO has any recommendations in regards to consulting parties that may have an interest in your project, including federally recognized Indian tribes. And you can request information regarding professionally qualified cultural resource professionals or firms if you feel that you need this assistance. In step 2, in order to provide project delays, grantees should ensure they utilize qualified cultural resource professionals to prepare the Section 106 consultation materials. This will ensure that documentation meets state standards and FRA needs, and we'll talk more about what a professionally qualified person is later in the presentation. So in step 2, we would be looking to the grantee to complete any sort of surveys that might be triggered as a result of your project. In step 3, the grantee should draft the Section 106 consultation materials for FRA's review, approval, and signature. This, of course, includes any required cultural resource or archaeological survey reports. Then in step 4, FRA would review those materials. And in step 5, if FRA had any comments or additional requests for information, the grantee should respond and address those. One of the common mistakes that we do see grantees make, which leads to project delays, is being non-responsive to FRA's information requests and or not asking for technical assistance if they need clarification on what information FRA is seeking. In step 6, FRA approves and signs the finalized materials. And then ultimately, the grantee would distribute the Section 106 consultation materials to SHPO, tribes and or consulting parties on behalf of FRA. Section 106 timeframes vary depending on the type and location of your project, the type and number of historic properties involved, whether the project will have adverse effects on historic properties, if there's any public controversy regarding your project, and also when in the project planning or design process, FRA receives adequate documentation from the grantee to advance the Section 106 process. In general, we would define adequate documentation as that which meets SHPO or state standards, is determined by FRA to be legally sufficient per the Section 106 regulations, which again can be found at 36 CFR Part 800, and or addresses FRA's documentation needs or requests to verify appropriate application of the program comment. FRA can provide examples of adequate Section 106 materials if you have questions. If you need these materials, please coordinate this request through your FRA regional or project manager or the environmental protection specialist assigned to your project. This slide provides general timeframes specific to Section 106. Please remember that Section 106 is one of many environmental planning laws under the NEPA umbrella that needs to be complete before a grant can be obligated. So this is not representative of an entire environmental review timeline. And I certainly hope this slide convinces you to think about Section 106 early in project planning. Again, timeframes are contingent upon the receipt of adequate documentation. If the program comment is 100% applicable, Section 106 can typically be completed in less than 1 month. If Section 106 consultation is required, grantees should factor in a 30-day regulatory review by SHPO and relevant consulting parties for every consultation package submitted, and some projects do require multiple submissions. If adverse effects are identified and need to be resolved, grantees should factor in 6 months to 1 year in their project planning timeframe. Next, we're going to talk a little bit more about the who and then the when. Again, as the grantee, remember, consider Section 106 early in the planning process to ensure you account for time or cost needed to complete the Section 106 review. For preliminary engineering or NEPA grants, by their nature, these fund environmental reviews, which include Section 106 related work. However, grantees should specifically factor Section 106 related work into the budgets and schedules included in their applications. For final design and construction grants, in order for environmental review activities, including Section 106 related work, to be eligible for reimbursement, they must be included in the grant application and, most importantly, in the USDOT FRA approved grant agreement scope of work. Overall, eligible costs may vary by type of grant, track 123, and or grant program. Check the Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFO. It includes an FRA point of contact who can answer questions when you are preparing or before you submit a grant application. Other reminders: you are responsible for preparing all Section 106 materials for FRA's review and approval, including the completion of architectural and/or archaeological surveys. Use qualified professionals to ensure you are generating adequate documentation, and certainly ask for technical assistance if you need it. Also utilize the program comment exempted activities list to the greatest extent possible. This helps minimize level of effort, time, and costs associated with your Section 106 review. And then don't forget to submit the documentation that helps justify that proposal. This is a reminder again that FRA is responsible for complying with 106, and grantees should assist FRA in meeting this legal obligation. There are certain things that you can do and cannot do. Do informally coordinate with SHPO to gather information and help prepare Section 106 materials for FRA's review and approval. Do not formally consult with SHPO or federally recognized Indian tribes on FRA's behalf or independent of FRA. FRA has a special government-to-government relationship with tribes that cannot be delegated. Do submit FRA-approved materials to SHPO or tribes on FRA's behalf once authorized by FRA to do so. Do not submit architectural or archaeological reports directly to SHPO or tribes until approved and authorized by FRA. As stated previously, grantees are expected to do the substantive legwork for a Section 106 review and should engage qualified professionals or consultants to ensure the adequacy of documentation. Using the right people can reduce level of effort and save time. A qualified professional or consultant should meet the Secretary of Interior's professional qualification standards in architecture, historic architecture, architectural history, archaeology, or other closely related field. In order to be considered SOI qualified, as we call it, an individual generally has to have an advanced degree in their area of expertise, coupled with professional experience. FRA also recommends that any ideally qualified professional or consultant would also have Section 106 experience, experience with federal agencies, experience with railroads and rail infrastructure, and or hold any required state permits or licenses to conduct fieldwork in your state. Some SHPOs do maintain lists of qualified professionals or could provide recommendations for qualified consultants. So feel free to reach out to your State Historic Preservation Office if you need help identifying the types of individuals that can assist you on your project. Again, FRA is responsible for providing technical assistance to you, the grantees, verifying appropriate application of the program comment, authorizing grantees to initiate Section 106 consultation. That would be the informal activities that we talked about in terms of gathering information, reaching out, identifying folks who may be interested in your, the historic properties in your project. FRA is also responsible for reviewing and approving all Section 106 materials, government-to-government consultation with federally recognized Indian tribes, making official effects determinations under Section 106, and then finally, if your project results in the negotiation of an agreement document, such as a memorandum of agreement or a programmatic agreement, FRA would be monitoring the grantee's implementation of those mitigation measures. Hopefully you've picked up on the best practices and common mistakes highlighted throughout this presentation. As a reminder, railroad infrastructure is often subject to Section 106 reviews, and Section 106 reviews are a critical step toward the obligation or approval of your grant or project. Section 106 can also have time and cost implications for your project and should be incorporated early into your project planning activities. By understanding Section 106 requirements in FRA's grant review process, and through the use of qualified professionals, you can ensure completion of a Section 106 review in a timely and efficient manner. Now we're going to move on to our third set of poll questions.
All right, our first question is, FRA is legally responsible for compliance with Section 106. Grantees, or project sponsors, can assist by informally gathering data from SHPO and drafting Section 106 consultation materials for FRA's review and approval. And we'll give that just a few seconds here for answers. All right, thank you all so much who participated. The answer was true. That is true. Our next question is, if grantees or project sponsors believe the program comment exempted activities apply to their project, they must A, provide FRA with supporting documentation to verify appropriate usage, B, list the Appendix A category and number for each activity in the scope of work, C, include this information in my environmental documentation, or D, all of the above. I see people are still answering, so we're just going to give it a few more seconds. All right, the correct answer was D, and about 96% got that correct. All right, and our last polling question for set C is, what will ensure an efficient and timely Section 106 review? And please choose all that apply. A, utilizing qualified cultural resource professionals. B, respond to FRA's request for information. C, starting the Section 106 process late in the project planning design process. Or D, asking FRA for technical assistance. All right, just going to give that just a few more seconds here. All right, the correct answers were both A, utilizing qualified cultural resource professionals, B, respond to FRA's request for information, and D, asking FRA for technical assistance. All right, back over to you.
Okay, this is Laura again. So we thought it would be helpful to apply the information that Catherine presented to an FRA-funded project. So on the slide is an example excerpt from a grant application, and this is an example of a type of rail project that FRA has funded more and more often in recent years. The purpose and need for this project is very clear and straightforward. It's to ensure that rail traffic over this existing rail line can operate safely and efficiently. So just looking at the example on the screen, this project is involving upgrades or replacements to railroad bridges as well as track replacement. So based on just the description on that screen, FRA would likely be able to conclude that the track replacement is exempt from Section 106 review under the program comment. We conclude that the demolition and replacement of the railroad bridges will require a standard Section 106 review. Regarding the upgrades to existing rail bridges, those may or may not be exempt from Section 106 under the program comment, depending on the exact nature of the work that the grantee is proposing to do. So to complete the Section 106 review, more details are needed. So regarding the upgrades to existing bridges, FRA would typically ask the grantee for the following information. Which bridges will be upgraded and what specifically do those upgrades entail? Has the grantee reviewed the list of exempted activities in the program comment, particularly those in Section B of the table, and have they proposed which activities they believe apply to their project? Recently, something that's been pretty helpful is that grantees have been providing to FRA a table that breaks down the various project activities and matches them up with the Section 106 exempted activities, and providing accompanying narrative where appropriate. I realize that often it might be an engineer that's doing this, and engineers and the environmental folks may speak a bit of a different language, but the good news is that recently we reorganized our division and we have the environmental reviewers and several engineers in the same division. So we often will confer with engineers if we have questions about specific terminology. So generally, repairs or replacement of bridge components that are done in kind will be exempt from Section 106 review under the program comment. As Catherine mentioned earlier, in kind means that new materials used in repairs or replacements match the material being repaired or replaced in design, color, texture, other visual properties, and, where possible, materials. So for example, replacing a deteriorated timber trestle with a new timber trestle is likely exempt. However, replacing a deteriorated timber trestle with a new concrete trestle would likely not be exempt because that would involve a significant change in material and be very visibly evident. When replacing less prominent components, such as caps or stringers, material properties may be less important than visual properties. For example, a change in material, such as from timber to concrete, may be acceptable for smaller or less prominent components. FRA would make this determination on a case-by-case basis, and our determination may be based on the type of the bridge, the relative scale of the proposed changes, and/or whether the bridge has been previously altered. FRA understands that for repair and rehab work, a change in material may be more economical because of the current cost of construction materials, or may require less long-term maintenance. So just be aware that if you're proposing to change the material, particularly of a very prominent visible component of a bridge, a standard Section 106 review is likely going to be necessary, and just account for it in the schedule and budget. However, if the objectives of your project can be achieved using the same materials as existing, and you're willing to use those materials, and there wouldn't be any significant increase in construction or maintenance costs, and it wouldn't jeopardize the safety of the infrastructure, it's likely that if you do that work in kind, Section 106 review will be exempt and the process will conclude much more quickly. For the bridges to be replaced, again, that would be subject to a standard Section 106 review. It's very clear in the program comment that the wholesale demolition and replacement of bridges is not an exempt activity. So we would want to know which bridges will be replaced and what types of bridges are they. I mean, we recognize that you may have a bridge that spans a major navigable river or just a minor water crossing. So just knowing what types of bridges are is very important. And as well as what year were the bridges constructed. And have there been any major repairs or alterations to the bridges in the past? And are any of the bridges listed on or potentially eligible for listing on the National Register, or might they contribute to an eligible rail line? As Catherine explained, things to consider include, is there an association with a significant person such as an engineering firm or a railroad company? Is there an association with a significant event such as establishing a community or economic expansion? Is the bridge a notable example of a particular architectural style, or perhaps did the design help overcome an engineering challenge or illustrate a new technology? As we emphasized earlier in the presentation, this is really the part of the Section 106 process where FRA encourages our grantees to hire qualified cultural resources consultants who can assist in the evaluation of potential historic significance of the rail line and of the rail bridges that are part of that line. And just keep in mind that our staff that conduct these reviews, we are mostly located in DC, so anytime you can send color photographs, that really goes a long way. And lastly, for this sort of project, we would also need information regarding associated activities that are necessary to construct the project, such as will the work sites be accessed from the tracks and or from existing access roads, or will new access roads need to be constructed? Will areas for construction equipment or material staging be located within or outside of the right-of-way? And will there be any in-water work? And if so, what's the nature and extent? So, for example, if you are doing work on a particularly large bridge across a river, there may be the need to use anchored barges. So please account for that, because there is a potential that there could be submerged archaeological resources that could be affected by those construction activities. The next couple of slides just go over some resources that are available online. They're in the web links window on the Adobe Connect site. And again, this presentation will be on our website later. So we tried to gear this presentation more specifically to FRA's requirements and what FRA does, but the Advisory Council also offers some very basic training on Section 106 that you may also wish to take. I wanted to say thank you to, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Catherine.
I was just going to jump in a little bit. Just to let you guys know, ACHP, right, they were the federal agency that wrote the regulations, or the sort of the instruction manual on how federal agencies comply with Section 106. They have a number of really good free online e-learning classes that you can take, and additionally, throughout the month of May, they are offering free special webinars on various 106 related topics, including just general information about Section 106, defining APEs, documentation standards, and also agreement documents. So if you are interested in pursuing additional training related to 106, we highly recommend that. And any of those training opportunities can be accessed via ACHP's website, which is achp.gov.
Thanks, Catherine. So that was the end of our formal slides, but many of you submitted questions before the webinar during your registration. So thank you for doing that. We hope we addressed several of those already in the presentation. There were a few that didn't quite fit in the slides that are important that I can go ahead and answer now. And then I see that several folks have added questions during the webinar today, and we will try to address those as well. If we run out of time or if some of these are trickier questions that we can't get to, we do have an email address on the very last slide that you'll see in a moment, and feel free to email us with any questions that we didn't get to today. So one question that we received was, how do FRA's Section 106 requirements differ from USDOT's sister agencies? So fundamentally, Section 106 requirements are the same for all federal agencies because we are following the same set of regulations that were put out by the ACHP. But many FRA grantees, particularly state DOTs, may have experience working with the Federal Highways Administration. Because of the nature of FHWA's programs, they have designated Section 106 work to state DOTs, and or they have statewide programmatic agreements in place that streamline the Section 1 review process for highway projects, so they typically don't go through the standard 4-step review. FRA does have several Section 106 programmatic agreements in place, but these are typically for specific and complex rail projects where construction and funding are phased over many years. However, we don't have statewide programmatic agreements because our grantees vary very widely year to year. These agreements are negotiated with specific project sponsors, so we really don't have the capacity to be negotiating them because we don't know who our project sponsors might be year after year. In contrast, it makes sense for FHWA to have these statewide programmatic agreements in place because their grant recipients are the state DOTs and they are the same year after year. So if you're a grantee that has received both FRA and highways grants in the past, you may experience that the Section 106 processes vary between the two agencies. FRA is responsible for the decision-making that FHWA may have delegated to state DOTs. Also, FHWA-specific Section 106 mitigation measures that are established in their statewide PAs do not apply to FRA-funded projects. However, the Section 106 program comment for rail rights-of-way can be used by all USDOT agencies as well as non-DOT agencies that may be providing permits or funding or licenses for projects in right-of-way. There was a question regarding sub-recipient monitoring requirements. I'm not quite sure what that was asking, but typically, our grant agreements are with the grantee, so if there's a pass-through to a subrecipient, the grantees would be responsible for monitoring those subrecipients. And there was a question about what protocols FRA uses if human remains are encountered, and what our protocols are for curation of archaeological remains. So we follow standard stop work protocols that are typical for construction projects. The contractor would stop work and secure the area, and then they would notify the grantee, local police, and FRA. If it's not a crime scene, FRA would consult with the SHPO and or tribes with an interest in that area to determine how to treat the discovery. Construction cannot resume until such consultation has occurred. Curation of archaeological materials would follow applicable federal, state, or tribal requirements. This may depend on ownership of the land where the materials were located. And typically, archaeological materials are curated at an approved state repository. And if we have a project that already had a MOA or PA in place, we always include stipulations in those agreements that address unanticipated discoveries and human remains. So I think that addresses the questions that came in ahead of time, and I see that several have come in during this webinar. So I can try and answer those on the fly right now. I'll take a stab at it, and Catherine, if you want to chime in, please do. So I'm just going to scroll up here and see what came in. Okay, so consulting parties. Consulting parties can vary widely depending on the nature of the project. Typically, we would invite local governments, tribes, particularly if there is it's ground disturbance, or if you have a project that's creating a brand new rail line. There may be a railroad historical society that's interested, property owners, if there's any property acquisitions involved with the project. So it really varies by project, where the project is located. And we often will ask SHPOs for a bit of advice as well. But no, so it's different for each project. We invite certain consulting parties, and they can either decline or accept. If they decline, then we're done. But if they do want to consult, then we involve them throughout the rest of the process. Catherine, do you want to take the next one for your note there?
Yeah, in relation to direct and indirect effects, yes, there have been some recent court decisions that have slightly tweaked the way that we represent direct and indirect effects within our actual written Section 106 consultation materials. In other words, instead of sort of parsing them out into direct effects or indirect effects in our written materials, we simply just refer to them all as effects because, in theory, they all have the potential to affect and/or are affecting historic properties. But the way that we approach the determination of whether or not things that we would typically see as direct or indirect, we still undergo the same type of analysis to essentially come to an overall effects finding. So yes, while there have been sort of semantic changes to how those are represented in formal Section 106 consultation materials, it does not in any way change how we approach determining how effects are made or the types of effects that need to be considered under Section 106.
And Catherine, do you want to take the next one or no? On the auditory?
Number 4?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit generally to this. So normally auditory effects are going to be related more to either increasing train traffic within existing rail corridors or adding new rail corridors where they didn't exist, and you're now introducing new sort of noise into the environment. Usually what you would need to do is have some sort of either noise and or vibration study that would give you the information for you to determine sort of how far out that noise would go. And if for some reason you find that there are historic properties within that distance, then you would go through the rest of the 106 steps to figure out whether or not that noise would have an adverse effect on that historic property and challenge essentially its ability to either remain listed in the National Register or to be eligible for listing in the National Register. And I know that there are some industry standards that we typically go to in terms of thresholds. I can't for the life of me name those off the top of my head right now. So Laura, I don't know if you can, but I think I believe FTA and or FHWA has sort of issued some industry standards, at least for DOT projects, that we generally default to in terms of determining when a threshold has been reached where impacts under NEPA and or effects under 106 could be considered. Laura, I don't know if you have anything to add to that or not.
No, we do have FTA and FRA guidance on this. This is most applicable if you are, for example, building a new rail line or adding substantial new service to an existing line. For the types of projects that I was just discussing earlier, just doing repairs on existing rail lines is, I would say, less of an issue. But certainly for more complex projects, we would provide technical assistance regarding the consideration of vibration and auditory effects.
Yeah, and I can take the next one too. There's a question, does erosion control or slope stabilization category within the program comment exempted activities list include stone retaining walls? It does. There are some caveats related to that where you might need to involve SOI qualified professionals when working with stone retaining walls that are determined to be historic. And again, the program comment can only be applied if your action would result in a no adverse effect. So if for some reason whatever you're doing to that stone retaining wall would result in an adverse effect, you cannot apply the exempted activities list. But hopefully with the use of a qualified professional, you can figure out a way to do it following the Secretary of Interior standards for historic properties. And end up in a no adverse effect situation, in which case we could either complete that through the application of the program comment, fastest way to do it, or for some reason it might trigger, I don't know, a Section 106 review in some instances.
Yeah, and I would just say in general, oh, go ahead. I'd say a general rule is if you are repairing or replacing component parts of something, if you can use the same materials as existing, you should be okay. So that would also apply to repairs of stone retaining walls. I can try and take question 7, although I'm not sure if this is regarding archaeological resources, or if for example, if a tunnel is going maybe underneath a neighborhood. So actually, I guess I don't have an answer for that right now because I'm not quite sure how to interpret that. But we do have a couple of projects where the grantee has been adding a second track to an existing rail line and sort of assumed that there was going to be nothing there, and in fact started construction and found out that they hit a neighborhood that had burned down during a race riot. So it is very important to realize that new construction of rail lines may impact archaeological resources. So that's why pre-planning to do surveys, particularly in urban areas, is critical. Regarding the other scenarios, such as doing a tunnel project under an urban area, that's certainly something to consider. Specialists would definitely be involved to sort of do geological studies and then figure out how deep you are going and see if there could be the potential to cause any vibration effects to any of the buildings that are standing above or near the tunnel.
I can take number 8. The question is, at what point in the project does FRA determine the APE, area potential effects, prior to submittal of the categorical exclusion worksheet? Again, if you're submitting your categorical exclusion worksheet, that does need to account for cultural resources and Section 106. So hopefully you have gotten the information that you would need to progress your Section 106 review and thus have the conclusion of that accurately represented in your categorical exclusion worksheet. So yes, the APE should be determined well before the submittal of the categorical exclusion worksheet. Otherwise, the CE worksheet would not be complete and not be representative of the cultural resource questions. I can also take number...
Oh, I was going to add on to Crystal's question about the timing. As Catherine indicated earlier, some of these projects on the NEPA side would qualify for ACE, but 106 could be sort of the longer lead item. So it would be appropriate to submit a draft CE that addresses other environmental resource areas, and maybe come back and populate the 106 section of the CE worksheet later if that's going to be the longer process, because that could help keep things moving. So that was just sort of one caveat there for the question about the timing of the APE and the CE worksheet.
Yeah. Okay, the next question we received, do state SHPOs need to agree with applying the program comment in order to use this option? The answer is no, they don't. The SHPOs were involved in the development of the programmatic agreement and the exempted activities list before the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation issued it, so they are at least aware of the types of activities that that are listed in there and the conditions for which we specified sort of in those general rules where they could be applied. If for some reason a SHPO is concerned about a particular project and the implementation of it and believes that it is not necessarily being done in a manner that does not result in adverse effects to historic properties, they can certainly reach out to FRA or the lead federal agency as well as ACHP, and then the federal agency would work with the project sponsor or grantee to address any of those concerns. But no, the SHPOs do not need to agree when we utilize the program comment.
Right, and to add on to that, that was also that was a time savings with the program comment was really the decision making stops with the lead federal agency and does not trigger the typical 30-day or longer SHPO review.
Yeah. For number 10, or one of the questions we have, can you comment on the use of rivets for in-kind bridge work? FHWA has determined that extensive replacements of rivets with bolts or replacement of highly visible connections can be adverse. Does FRA take a similar position to that of FHWA? I would say FRA's position is that it depends on the project. I know that we've recently had a big bridge project where this was a specific issue, and we asked for additional information related to the rivets, what they would look like, how they would actually be put onto the structure. And once we received that information, I think we coordinated back with the State Historic Preservation Office. We had determined no adverse effects because we felt that visually it was roughly the same. And I believe, if I'm correct, I think we actually got SHPO concurrence on that. So no, we don't necessarily always find that it would be an adverse effect, but again, it's going to depend on your project and the type of documentation that you can provide to us to help us justify one pathway or another.
Yeah, and in that scenario, if the replacements are that extensive, that could be a complication for applying the program comment. So as Catherine said, it might just be faster in the end to consult with SHPO.
And the last question I think that we received, on some large rail projects, the Army Corps of Engineers rather than FRA is the lead federal agency. These have proven to be more challenging when FRA takes the lead. Does FRA normally prefer to be the lead federal agency? There are many projects that involve the Army Corps of Engineers where we do take lead specifically for Section 106. Again, it is going to be done, that decision is going to be made on a case-by-case basis, particularly given the circumstances of what FRA's action is or level of involvement is with that particular project. And ultimately, while we can certainly ask the Army Corps if they would like us to be the lead for Section 106, we as FRA cannot make that decision on their behalf. And for the most part, for the projects at least that I've been involved in, Army Corps typically does designate us as the lead federal agency, but you know, I think in some projects they prefer to sort of remain on their own. Again, we will attempt to go down that path if it makes sense in terms of FRA's involvement in the project. But again, that is ultimately up to the Army Corps of Engineers to decide.
And we had a last question about if we will post the questions and answers. So typically this webinar would have been recorded, I believe, including this last Q&A session, but because of the hiccups we had earlier, this may not be the cleanest thing to post. So I think if you have a question that's related to Section 106, we do have an email address. Let's see. Yep, thank you, on the last slide there. So feel free to email the questions there, and we can get back to you one-on-one.
Yeah, and on behalf of FRA and Laura and I, thank you all, number one, for your patience in the technical difficulties we experienced early on, but also for participating today. We certainly hope the information will be helpful to you. And again, as we just stated, we will have this posted in some form on FRA's website so that if you would like to, it was a lot of information to download, so if you'd like to go back and review it independently at a later time, that will certainly be available for you in the near future. Typically, we like to get things on the website within about a week, but we will need to coordinate with our communications division, and that will partly depend on their ability to do that. And also how if we need to re-record this in any sort of way. So thank you all very much. We really appreciate it, and we certainly hope that you got some good takeaways and learned at least something from today's webinar. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you, everyone.